The media and persuasion. We live in a media-saturated world. A 2011 compilation of studies found that every day, on average, the American adult watches 4.34 hours of TV and video, surfs the internet for 2.47 hours, listens to 1.34 hours of radio, and reads newspapers or magazines for 0.44 of an hour. These figures have only increased over time. A more recent report indicates that U.S. adults spend, on average, 12 hours, 7 minutes a day consuming media, 2017. All told, over half the waking hours of most Americans are spent taking in various types of broadcast, online, and print media. This far exceeds the time spent in face-to-face social interaction with friends and family. The power of the media. How powerful are the media in actually shaping our attitudes? Documenting the effects of the media on people's attitudes is no simple task. Researchers have done some experiments, but more typically they've relied on surveys in which people report which programs and ads they've seen. The investigator then examines whether those exposed to certain programs or ads hold opinions that are closer to the advocated positions than the opinions of people who have less exposure to the same media. Retrospective self-reports, however, are notoriously fallible. If participants say they have seen some ad or say they have not, how can researchers be sure? How can they be sure viewers saw the ad under the same conditions? Most importantly, what about self-selection effects? For example, highly motivated citizens are more likely to tune into political ads than less motivated citizens. Any apparent effect of an ad campaign is confounded by these differences in political motivation. Regardless of these difficulties, many studies attest to the power of the media to influence people's tastes, opinions, and behavior. Interestingly, recent data suggests that the power of broadcast media doesn't just arise from the fact that it reaches a wide audience. It's also the sheer awareness of each person in the audience of this broad reach. That is, when people perceive that they're attending to a stimulus, for example, a televised political speech, simultaneously with many others, a phenomenon known as shared attention, they're inclined to process the stimulus more deeply, resulting in persuasion via the ELM's central route. In addition, researchers are increasingly paying attention to the role of social media in persuasion. Consider the use of social media platforms like Facebook. Although many people use Facebook primarily for social and entertainment purposes, this platform provides a forum for people to express their opinions on political candidates, parenting practices, current events, restaurants, and so on. Facebook and other social media platforms also serve as a source of news for many people, a fact that became especially well known during and after the 2016 U.S. presidential election due to accusations of the Russian government using social media to meddle in the election. Regardless of the precise ways that people use social media, platforms like Facebook expose us to others' opinions, and growing evidence suggests that such exposure can sway our opinions and behavior. So even though social media might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think about persuasive arenas, persuasion may well be occurring more subtly while people are using such forms of media for other purposes. The media and conceptions of social reality. Some researchers have pointed to a more indirect, but arguably more profound and unsettling influence of the media, shaping our very conception of social reality. For example, even if specific advertisements don't succeed at getting us to buy specific products, they could still sway us to believe that personal happiness lies in materialistic pursuits. Television and film portrayals of U.S. society can be misleading about, for example, actual levels of racial or socioeconomic diversity in a given region or country. And political ads may not get us to vote for a particular candidate, but they may lead us to conclude that the country is going downhill. Political scientist Shanto Iyengar and social psychologist Donald Kinder refer to this effect of the media as agenda control. Media of all types substantially contribute to shaping the information we think is broadly true and important. For example, the prominence given to certain issues in the news media, crime, traffic congestion, or economic downturns, is correlated with the public's perception that these issues are important. In one experiment, viewers in one condition saw 3 news stories dealing with U.S. dependence on foreign energy sources. In another condition, 6 such stories, and in a final condition, no stories like this. When exposed to no news about dependence on foreign energy, 24% of the viewers cited energy as one of the 3 most important problems facing the country. This percentage rose to 50% for the participants who saw 3 stories on the subject, and 65% for those who saw 6 stories. Therefore, a politician in office should hope that news reports focus on things that are going well at the time, and a politician who wishes to defeat the incumbent should hope that the media focuses on things that are not going well. Box 8.4. Agenda control in films. Sofia Coppola's film, The Beguiled, featured a cast lacking in racial diversity. Coppola was criticized for not including the African-American character who appeared in the book on which the film was based. Such biased media portrayals can result in misleading portraits of the world. Agenda control. Efforts of the media to select certain events and topics to emphasize, thereby shaping which issues and events people think are important. George Gerbner and his colleagues have explored the agenda control thesis by coding the content of television programs and looking at the attitudes of heavy TV viewers. It should come as no surprise that the world depicted on most TV shows scarcely resembles social reality. On primetime programs, for example, males outnumber females by a factor of 3 to 1, and recent analyses of popular films from 2007 to 2012 find that women have only about 25% of the speaking roles. Ethnic minorities, young children, and older adults are also underrepresented. Crime is wildly more prevalent per unit of time on primetime shows than in the average American's real life. And heavy TV viewers, those who watch 5 hours or more per day, construe social reality much like the reality they see on the screen. They tend to endorse more racially prejudiced attitudes, assume that women have more limited abilities than men, and overestimate the prevalence of violent crime. These findings could, of course, be the result of self-selection. Perhaps more prejudiced, cynical, and uninformed people watch more TV in the first place, but the results are still worth pondering. Box 8.4. Focus on the media. The hostile media phenomenon. Accusations of media bias in coverage of the U.S. presidential race have been commonplace throughout modern history. For example, Richard Nixon maintained that the media were run by an elite Jewish clique. During his run for president in 2008, John McCain claimed the media were treating Barack Obama uncritically in biased fashion, reacting to him as if he were a rock star rather than looking critically at his political agenda. Meanwhile, his running mate, Sarah Palin, derided the lamestream media for having what she perceived as a consistent liberal bias. Accusations of media bias from both sides of the aisle were particularly heated and frequent during the 2016 presidential campaign. Such accusations have continued since Trump took office, such as ones that arose about media coverage of Trump's controversial comments in the wake of the 2017 white supremacy protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. And of course, since he assumed office, President Trump has regularly derided even the mainstream media as presenting fake news. The thesis that the media are ideologically biased regularly leads to the publication of best-selling books that appeal to liberals and conservatives alike. An entire organization, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR, www.fair.org, is devoted to documenting bias in the media, showing, for instance, that conservatives are more likely to appear as experts on such news shows as Nightline. Research by Robert Vallone, Lee Ross, and Mark Lepper, 1985, suggests that we all tend to believe the media are biased against our preferred causes. According to these researchers, most people believe they see the world in a reasonable, objective fashion, a fallacy known as naive realism. See Chapter 1. Thus, any media presentation that attempts to present both sides of an issue is going to be perceived as biased by both sides of any controversy. This basic tendency to perceive the media as hostile is a regularity in the political theater of presidential politics, as well as a common feature in our perception of the media. In one telephone survey conducted 3 days before the 1980 U.S. presidential election, among Jimmy Carter supporters who felt the media had favored one candidate in its coverage, 83% thought it favored Reagan. In contrast, for Reagan supporters who felt the media had been biased, 96% felt the media had favored Carter. One thing we can all agree on, the media are biased. President Trump tweet, "If the people of our great country could only see how viciously and inaccurately my administration is covered by certain media." Perceived bias in the media. The hostile media phenomenon is arguably stronger than ever in today's political and media climate. Accusations of bias on the part of mainstream media seem to accompany reports of any controversial event or issue. The leader of our country himself regularly tweets about such bias against him. Looking back, most people believe that the media are quite effective in directly influencing public opinion, but this influence may often be indirect. The greatest effects of the media seem to involve influencing conceptions of reality and exerting agenda control, making people feel that certain issues are particularly important. Resistance to persuasion. Despite the degree to which we're immersed in media of different kinds on a daily basis, several reviews suggest that the media have only a small effect on what we buy, whom we vote for, and whether or not we adopt healthier habits. Why? Part of the answer lies in the fact that many of the important principles of social psychology, such as the influence of our perceptual biases, previous commitments, and prior knowledge, serve as sources of independent thought and significant forces of resistance in the face of persuasive attempts. Attentional biases and resistance. The U.S. Office of the Surgeon General issued a report in 1964 linking smoking to lung cancer. This presumably incontrovertible evidence about the related health risks would logically have both smokers and non-smokers shifting their attitude about smoking, and yet, following the release of the report, 40% of smokers found the document to be flawed, compared with 10% of non-smokers. We all like to think we absorb data and information in relatively unbiased fashion. If we learn that a particular practice or habit is dangerous to our health, we should alter our attitude accordingly. But our minds sometimes respond selectively to information in a way that maintains our initial point of view. Let's break this down into two concepts: selective attention and selective evaluation. Several studies indicate that people are inclined to attend selectively to information that confirms their original attitudes. We tune into information that reinforces our attitudes, and we tune out information that contradicts them. In one study, students who either supported or opposed the legalization of marijuana listened to a message that advocated legalization. The message contained 14 arguments. 7 were strong and difficult to refute, and thus clearly appealing to the pro-legalization students, and 7 were silly and easy to refute, and thus very attractive to the anti-legalization students. The students heard the message through earphones, accompanied by a continual static buzz. To combat this problem, students could press a button to eliminate the buzz for 5 seconds. As you might have anticipated, the pro-legalization students pushed the button more often when the speaker was delivering the strong arguments in favor of legalization. They wanted to hear the information that would reinforce their own viewpoint. The anti-legalization students, in contrast, were more likely to push the button while the speaker was offering up the easy-to-refute arguments in favor of legalization. They wanted to hear the weakness of the pro-arguments, thereby reinforcing their anti-legalization position. When I believe in something, I'm like a dog with a bone. Melissa McCarthy. During presidential elections, people are more inclined to subscribe to and read newspapers, blogs, and websites that support their preferred candidate and avoid those that support the opposition. Such selective attention, in turn, forms the basis of algorithms that drive the results of people's internet searches, as well as the content of their social media feeds, leading to the creation of echo chambers. It's this phenomenon that made Donald Trump's presidential victory a shock to many liberals, whose social media feeds, in the days leading up to the election, suggested that Clinton would likely triumph. Social scientists of all stripes have discussed the tendency people have to evaluate information, such as the credibility of a source or the soundness of an argument, in ways that support their existing beliefs and values. Someone who believes that the importance of climate change is exaggerated is likely to see more flaws in an article urging steps to combat global warming than is someone who believes that climate change is a defining issue of the times. Peter Ditto and his colleagues have shown that selective evaluation extends to evidence that violates cherished beliefs about one's personal health. Patients who receive unhealthy diagnoses are more likely to downplay both the seriousness of the diagnosis and the validity of the test that produced it. In one study, Dito and Lopez, 1992, gave undergraduates a test of a fictitious medical condition, a deficiency that was supposedly associated with pancreatic disorders later in life. The test was simple. Put saliva on a piece of yellow paper and observe whether it changes color in the next 20 seconds. In the deficiency condition, participants were told that if the paper remained yellow, they had the medical condition. In the no deficiency condition, participants were told that if the paper changed to a dark green, they had the medical condition. You won't be surprised to know the paper remained yellow throughout the study. Clearly, participants in the deficiency condition would be motivated to see the paper change color, and they should be disturbed by the evidence confronting them, the paper remaining yellow. And indeed, as shown in figure 8.4, see page 262, these participants took almost 30 seconds longer than those who got more favorable evidence to decide that their test was finished, repeatedly dipping the paper in saliva to give it every possible opportunity to turn green. Given our tendency to selectively attend to and evaluate incoming messages in ways that confirm our pre-existing attitudes, it's no surprise that media effects can be weak in producing attitude change. Most messages, it would seem, end up mainly preaching to the choir. Wake up, guns kill. Blame the criminals, not my guns. Selective framing. Like selective evaluation of evidence that supports or contradicts one's attitude, people can also frame the same issue, in this case gun control, in a selective manner. People in favor of gun control frame guns as the main reason for gun-related deaths, whereas those opposed to gun control frame the problem in terms of those who shoot the guns. Figure 8.4, Selective Evaluation. People who are personally motivated will be more skeptical of information that challenges cherished beliefs. This is for the experiment showing that people who the test showed they had a deficiency waited for their test paper to change for longer than people with a no deficiency group. Previous commitments and resistance. Many persuasive messages fail because they can't overcome the target audience's previous commitments. Anti-drug campaigns are aimed at decreasing habitual drug-taking behavior, which is embedded in a way of life and a community of friends centered around drugs. Some forces of resistance to change may be even more formidable than habits. Genetics, for example. Research reveals that our political allegiances are passed from parent to child to a degree and seem to be part of our DNA. Box 8.5. Ads that try to get people to shift their political allegiances must, in effect, convince voters to abandon these deep commitments. There's also evidence that public commitments, declarations of one's attitude around a given issue in a public setting, make people resist attitude change. In addition, public commitments might make people resistant to conformity. See Ash's line judgment studies in Chapter 9. In some studies, when participants made public commitments to their attitudes, as people do every day when discussing politics and social issues with their friends, they were more resistant to subsequent counter-attitudinal messages than control participants. Why do public commitments increase our resistance to persuasion? One basic reason is that it's hard to back down from such endorsements without losing face, even when evidence is presented against the position we publicly embraced. A less obvious reason is that public commitments engage us in more extensive thoughts about a particular issue, which tends to produce more extreme, entrenched attitudes. Abraham Tesser labeled this idea the thought polarization hypothesis. To test his hypothesis, Tesser measured participants' attitudes about social issues, such as legalizing prostitution, 1975. He then had them think for a few moments about the issue. When they stated their opinions about the same issue a second time, they routinely gave stronger ratings. Both opponents and proponents became polarized. Public commitment and resistance. When people commit to a position on an issue publicly, this can increase their resistance to attempts to persuade them otherwise. Thought polarization hypothesis. The hypothesis that more extended thought about a particular issue tends to produce a more extreme, entrenched attitude. Similarly, the repeated expression of attitudes has been shown to lead to more extreme positions in a variety of domains, including viewpoints about particular people, artwork, fashions, and football strategies. But a caveat is in order here. Increased thought about an attitude object can lead to more moderate attitudes for people who previously had little motivation to think about the issue or little pre-existing knowledge about it. Box 8.5, focus on biology. The genetic basis of attitudes. One of the deepest sources of our commitment to strong attitudes and resistance to persuasive messages is our genes. Work by Abraham Tesser in 1993 indicates that our opinions and beliefs are in part inherited. He examined the attitudes of monozygotic, identical twins who share 100% of their genes, and those of dizygotic, fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes. For most of the viewpoints surveyed, the identical twins' attitudes were more similar than those of fraternal twins. This was true, for example, for opinions about the death penalty, jazz, censorship, divorce, and socialism. Moreover, researchers found that the more heritable attitudes were also more accessible, less susceptible to persuasion, and more predictive of feelings of attraction to a stranger who had similar attitudes. Of course, there is no gene for attitudes about censorship or socialism. The hereditary transmission must occur through some element of temperament, such as impulsivity, a preference for risk-taking, or a distaste for novelty, which might make a person dislike jazz but be more tolerant of censorship. More recent research by James Fowler and his colleagues found that genes account not only for politically relevant attitudes, as Tesser documented, but also for political participation, 2008. They found that identical twins were more likely to resemble each other than were fraternal twins in sharing party affiliations and in their likelihood of voting in an election. No wonder it's often hard to shift people's political opinions and voting preferences and behavior. Doing so would require changing a basic part of who they are. Knowledge and resistance. As you learned in reading about the ELM approach to persuasion, prior knowledge makes people engage with persuasive messages through the central route, thereby leading them to scrutinize those messages carefully. People with a great deal of knowledge are more resistant to persuasion. Their beliefs and habits, and sometimes emotions, are tied up with their attitudes, and thus their point of view tends to be fixed. This insight has been repeatedly borne out in the experimental literature. In a study of attitudes about environmental preservation, Wendy Wood, 1982, divided students into two groups: those who were pro-preservation and knew a lot about the issue, and those who were pro-preservation but knew less about the subject. She exposed these two groups to a message opposed to environmental preservation. Those with a lot of knowledge about the environment changed their stance only a little bit, as they counter-argued a great deal in response to the message, relying on what they already knew and strongly believed about the issue. In contrast, the less knowledgeable students shifted their attitudes considerably toward the anti-preservation message. Attitude inoculation. Thus far, we've looked at how people's belief systems, their biases and pre-existing knowledge, make them resistant to persuasion and attitude change. Social psychologists have discovered some techniques that can be used to strengthen these tendencies. McGuire developed one such technique, which found inspiration in a rather unusual source: inoculation against viruses. When we receive an inoculation, we're exposed to a weak dose of the virus. This small exposure stimulates our immune system, which is then prepared to defend against larger dosages of the viruses. McGuire believed that resistance to persuasion could be encouraged in a similar fashion by attitude inoculation, small attacks on our beliefs that would engage our pre-existing attitudes, prior commitments, and background knowledge, and thereby counteract a larger attack. 1981. In his studies on attitude inoculation, McGuire first assessed participants' endorsements of different cultural truisms to confirm a pre-existing attitude, such as, "It's a good idea to brush your teeth after every meal if at all possible," or, "The effects of penicillin have been, almost without exception, of great benefit to mankind." More than 75% of the participants checked 15 on a 15-point scale to indicate their agreement with truisms like these. Then came the intervention. McGuire and Papagorgas exposed participants to a small attack on their belief in the truism. In the toothbrushing case, they might read, "Too frequent brushing tends to damage the gums and expose the vulnerable parts of the teeth to decay." In some conditions, the researchers had the participants refute that attack by offering arguments against it. This was the attitude inoculation, akin to a small dose of a virus stimulating the immune system. In other conditions, the researchers had participants consider arguments in support of the truism. Then, at some time between 1 hour and 7 days later, The participants read a 3-paragraph, full-scale attack on the truism. Figure 8.5 presents data that attests to the immunizing effectiveness of attitude inoculation. Attitude inoculation. Small attacks on people's beliefs that engage their pre-existing attitudes, prior commitments, and background knowledge, enabling them to counteract a subsequent larger attack and thus resist persuasion. Figure 8.5, Attitude Inoculation. This study shows that using pre-existing attitudes, commitments, and knowledge to come up with counter-arguments against an initial attack on an attitude makes people more resistant to persuasion in the face of a subsequent attack, third bar, compared with when there was no initial attack, second bar, or when they initially generated supportive arguments in favor of their attitude, fourth bar. Applied to a real-life situation, like a smoking prevention program, the idea would be to present people with pro-smoking arguments from peers and advertisements, such as smoking is about freedom and maturity, then encourage them to make counter-arguments. The hope would be that counter-arguing in response to an initial attack would inoculate them, thus making them more resistant to future inducements to smoke. Inoculation techniques would seem to be very useful in today's context, given how widely available and easily accessible fake news and other forms of misinformation are. Looking back, people can resist persuasive messages by selectively attending to and evaluating information that confirms their original attitudes and beliefs and ignoring or criticizing contradictory information. Attitudes tied up with considerable prior knowledge can be highly resistant to change. Attitude inoculation can make people resist persuasive attempts because the small attacks give them the chance to muster arguments to use when faced with stronger attacks on their beliefs and attitudes. Chapter Review Summary. Dual process approach to persuasion. A person's motivation and ability to think carefully and systematically about the content of a persuasive message determine which route is used. When using the central route to persuasion, people attend carefully to the message, and they consider relevant evidence and underlying logic in detail. People are especially likely to go through this route when motivation is high, the issue has personal consequences, and ability is high. They have a lot of knowledge in the domain. With the central route, people are sensitive to the quality of the persuasive arguments, leading them to be more persuaded when the arguments are strong, but not when they are weak. In the peripheral route to persuasion, people pay attention to superficial aspects of the message. They use this route when they have little motivation, the issue has no bearing on their outcomes, or ability to attend to its deeper meaning. They have little knowledge or are distracted. With this route, people are persuaded by easy-to-process cues, such as the attractiveness and credibility of the message source or the mere length of the persuasive message. The elements of persuasion. The elements of a persuasive attempt are the source of the message, who, the content of the message, what, and the audience of the message, to whom. Sources that are attractive, credible, and confident tend to be persuasive. Although a non-credible source is unlikely to induce immediate attitude change, a sleeper effect may occur, in which attitude change happens gradually after the message has become dissociated from its source. Vivid messages are usually more persuasive than matter-of-fact ones. An example is the identifiable victim effect, whereby messages with a single identifiable victim are more compelling than those without such vivid imagery. Messages that instill fear in the audience can also be effective, as long as they include information about the courses of action one can take to avoid the feared outcome, and guilt too. Advertisements in independent cultures emphasize the individual, and those in interdependent societies emphasize the collective. Characteristics of the audience affect whether a message is persuasive. They include the need for cognition, how deeply people like to think about issues, mood, and age. Metacognition and persuasion. Metacognition, people's thoughts about their thinking, can play a powerful role in persuasion. The self-validation hypothesis states that when people have greater confidence in their thoughts, they are more persuaded in the favorable or unfavorable direction of their thoughts. Bodily movements, such as head nodding or shaking, can indicate the level of confidence people have in their thoughts about an attitude, issue, or object. The media and persuasion. Documenting the effects of media on persuasion can be methodologically challenging, but there is no question that the media can shape opinions, tastes, and behavior to some degree. The media are most effective in agenda control, shaping what people think about by controlling, for example, the number and kinds of stories presented on various issues. Resistance to persuasion. People can be resistant to persuasion because of pre-existing biases, commitments, and knowledge. They selectively attend to and selectively evaluate information according to their original attitudes, tuning into what supports their prior attitudes and beliefs, and tuning out whatever contradicts them. Public commitment to a position helps people resist persuasion. Just thinking about an attitude object can produce thought polarization, movement toward extreme views that can be hard to change. People with more knowledge are more resistant to persuasion because they can counter-argue messages that take an opposite position to what they know and believe. Resistance to persuasion can be encouraged through attitude inoculation, exposing people to weak arguments against their position and allowing them to generate arguments against that opposing view.